of philosophy of psychiatry, moral and social philosophy, and she's especially interested in ethical problems associated with mental health and issues related to the diversity in our mental health experiences. Following on from a degree in social policy and politics, she received a PhD from the London School of Economics and has held academic positions at the LSE and at the University of Manchester. And her previous research has been in the area of political philosophy and democratic theory. She's the author of the book Deliberative Democracy, A Critical Introduction. In more recent years, and that's how I got to know Zsuzsanna, she's convened a number of fascinating workshops on themes including the ethics of mental health and illness and the philosophy of psychiatry and lived experience. So we're really delighted to have you here with us this afternoon, Zsuzsanna, and I'll now hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Annie. Thank you very much for inviting me as well. I'm really honored to be here this afternoon speaking to you. So, first of all, let me introduce and talk with a definition. Who are the minoritized scholars that I will be talking about? Well, at least the definition, my definition for this paper is scholars, whether in or outside academia, who have a minority status based on characteristics such as race, gender, sexuality, disability, ethnicity, geographic location, so maybe from the global south, class, socioeconomic status, and so on. And this might be coupled with overall marginalization and disadvantage, but for the purposes of this paper, I'm just thinking about the people who are in the minority in research environments. And coupled with this minority status, the kind of scholars I'm thinking about are also people whose research is related to aspects of their marginalized identity. And in this talk, I'm going to be focusing with my examples on mental health and mental health research, partly because I've got a lived experience of mental illness, and I am also doing research on philosophy related to mental illness. And I mean, obviously, this is also the Center for Society and Mental Health, so that's another very good reason to focus on this specific minoritization. This paper itself is kind of an example of the kind of research that I'm thinking about, because I am a minoritized scholar by this definition, doing research and writing about minoritized scholars. And minoritized scholars are really kind of people we might encounter in the humanities, social sciences, medicine, and so on. The kind of areas where we're studying humans or people and phenomena related to people. So electrons, for example, do not have a great interest in being respected in research. So the outline of the talk is the question I want to focus on is what should the role of minoritized scholars be? And I came to write this paper as I was doing research myself, because I kept thinking about how I should approach this research, what kind of role my own lived experience could play in doing research into mental illness. First, I'm going to look at a number of well-documented problems that minoritized scholars face. I'm very briefly going to think about what our role in research could be, and then I'm going to have a look at some ideas for solutions. And this is really the main original contribution that I'd hoped to make in this paper. So, as you probably know, it's recognized by universities, funding bodies, and generally in philosophy of science, that there are all kinds of benefits to diversity when it comes to the kind of researchers who are involved in research. Some of these may be epistemic benefits, which are benefits because having greater diversity of scholars will lead to better Knowledge generation, as different people will have different viewpoints. This is especially a familiar argument from feminist epistemology, developed by Helen Longino, and it's one of the main points of what is called standpoint epistemology, that we all occupy different epistemic standpoints, and including people with all these different epistemic standpoints is beneficial for research and knowledge generation. And of course, while diversity is beneficial in itself, so even if we doing something like researching particle physics, diversity is still beneficial, as different ways of thinking, different epistemic positionalities can lead to better development of theories. Lived experience may be particularly important, as we have a unique insight into what it is like to experience mental illness, for example, or what it is like to experience poverty, what it is like to experience chronic illness, and so on. There are also significant ethical benefits to diversity when it comes to researchers. Even if everyone had the exact same epistemic access, even if everyone had the exact same knowledge, we might still want to include different types of people in research because it tells us something about the equality and the equal status of different kinds of people in society. So what kind of people can do research? What kind of people are excluded? Historically, of course, women, non-white people, and so on were excluded largely from participating in academic research. So it just signals that people like this are also valuable members of our research community. And they make valuable individual contributions and have great understanding of various topics, regardless of their background. And especially, again, in the case of lived experience, it's a good signal that we are thinking of people not just as a subject of study, but we're also valuing people as persons. They are part of our community. They are part of the kind of people we want to be collaborating with. But minoritized scholars, nevertheless, navigate very difficult terrain. And I'm here focusing on work environments. And a lot of this is familiar from kind of navigating various minority statuses in any work environment, not just academia, but it might be specifically problematic if it has to do with the kind of research you're pursuing. So it might possibly make people take you more seriously or less seriously than they should, as we'll see in a moment. But first, the first issue I want to raise is that of disclosure. This is something that not everyone will face. So, although in the age of Zoom, even that we cannot take for granted. So, for example, a scholar in a wheelchair may not be a visible wheelchair user if they are presenting via Zoom, or if they are collaborating with people or talking to people via Zoom. Whereas if we were meeting them outside the internet, face to face, then they would not have to disclose that they are a wheelchair user. But for many of us, also in the case of mental illness, of course, lived experience of mental illness, this is something that comes up and something that has been studied, how and when people disclose mental illness in general and in particular at work. And most people do not disclose everything to everyone, so they will disclose bits of information over time as they think is appropriate. But especially if you are researching something which is related to your own lived experience, some colleagues you might sometimes feel a pressure to disclose from some colleagues, which might be quite well-meaning. It's not necessarily a malicious thing, but people might be asking you for more than you are willing to give. And that can be quite uncomfortable, as I found from my own experience. People will also worry about negative consequences, things like stigma and prospects for employment or promotion. Will I somehow be seen as less reliable if I disclose a chronic illness, if I disclose recurrent mental illness, for example? And there's always just this niggling question: are we fully colleagues? How will the others respond? I sometimes have this worry of being seen only as an expert by experience rather than a fully academic colleague. And I say only kind of chastising myself, because experts by experience also have very important role to play in areas like mental illness research. So they also have a very important contribution. But at the same time, I think their contribution, as much as it is still contested at the moment, is going to be somewhat different from the contribution of academic researchers who also hold lived experience of their subject of study, because it's a kind of intersectionality. We are both experts by experience, or we have both lived experience, and we have kind of academic experience or academic background. So we have these two types of expertise and two types of lived experience. And I will return to this point in a couple of slides. For some of us, passing may be an option, but it might come with high emotional costs. So I recognized early on that never mentioning my history of mental illness while also writing about mental illness is not going to be possible. But even when people disclose, covering is usually required. So passing, following terminology from Goffman's work, is hiding our stigmatized identity entirely, whereas covering is confessing, as it were, to a stigmatized identity, but at the same time trying to downplay it in most circumstances. And I found this tweet by Dr. Mona Massoud as quite a good illustration of what that can feel like. She says, mental health stigma is like, it's okay not to be okay, but make sure it's on your time off and it doesn't affect your productivity, and you really make up for the inconvenience it created for others. And so it's okay if you have mental illness or a history of mental illness, as long as you don't let that affect your work very much at all. But lack of disclosure could also be problematic, because your epistemic standpoint, your perspective on the world, given your lived experience, might affect your research in many ways, usually positive ways. But if you don't disclose where you get these insights and information from, then others might not recognize the value that lived experience adds. Sukaina Herji, a philosopher, writes about oppressive double binds. Often for minority researchers, there is no right response to problems in academic situations, and this comes specifically from the situation of their oppression or their stigmatized identity. Whether we disclose or not, how much we disclose and what we hold back, it doesn't matter what we do. It will always feel as if we're making the wrong choices. So epistemic problems when it comes to minorities have been recently a very popular topic in philosophy, and also are now very familiar outside of philosophy, and a lot of people are interested in them. So the most well-known of these is Miranda Fricker's epistemic injustice. This means that ignoring people's knowledge because we regard their status as a knower as less creditable. We regard some people's knowledge as deficient. So, you know, again, historically, and now as well, all kinds of minority groups, their knowledge may not be taken as seriously, either because we do not listen to them or because people do not even have the resources and tools to communicate their knowledge. And the main focus here is usually on a credibility deficit. People are not seen as credible knowers because of their status. So this might apply to minoritized scholars as well because of their minority status. At the same time, Olufemi Taiwo, political philosopher, writes about the problems of credibility excess. So he argues that often what we are faced with in politics or in academia is elite capture. So when we listen to people with mental illness, we listen to a very specific kind of people with mental illness, highly privileged people with mental illness usually. I mean, just organizing the various workshops that Annie mentioned, you know, I'm struck by the fact that philosophy of psychiatry and philosophy related to mental illness is incredibly wide. And it's, yes, so we listen to some kind of people, we listen to very educated people with supportive families, usually highly educated people who are then able to reach a point where they can communicate their experiences. So we might face credibility excess, is even though we're not representative, people with mental illness in general, you know, we are the ones that other academics get to meet. We are the ones that people listen to. You know, most people with serious mental illness do not have PhDs. You know, they have lower educational achievements than average. So we're going to be outliers, basically. And there's also the dangers of being a role model as elites and successful people with a certain minority status. So in disability studies, the supercrip stereotype is quite well known. Someone who overcomes all these various challenges that they face and through sheer grit and willpower, you know, achieves great success. And again, you know, that's not representative of the lives of most people with disability, chronic illness, mental illness. They're more likely to have lower socioeconomic status, lower educational achievement, lower income, greater rates of poverty, and so on. So these people, you know, the kind of people we often really want more justice for, you know, aren't actually represented. So we might have credibility deficit as scholars. We might be seen as slightly exotic or odd colleagues because on the basis of our minority status, in my case, because I have a history of mental illness. At the same time, I might have credibility access as an expert by experience. So colleagues without lived experience might think that my experience of mental illness is somehow particularly representative. But of course, knowing about intersectionality, we should realize that our experience is not the lived experience. It is just one among many. It's important, obviously, as the experience of every person is important, but it should not be taken as the basis of huge generalization in most cases. And in the case of mental health research, there's also often a perceived lack of insight on the case of people with mental illness. We do not really understand what's going on. We do not have great insight into our problems according to psychiatry. So if you don't have any insight into what's going in our heads, then how can we even do research about mental illness in general? Another form of epistemic oppression is epistemic exploitation, and I will follow here Nora Berenstein's definition from 2016. She argues that epistemic exploitation occurs when privileged persons compel marginalized persons to produce an education or explanation about the nature of the oppression they face. This constitutes unrecognized, uncompensated, emotionally taxing, coerced epistemic labor. It maintains structures of oppression by centering the needs and desires of dominant groups, and privileged persons benefit from these very oppressive systems about which they demand to be educated. So if a minoritized scholar is repeatedly asked to explain their lived experience, even beyond what they feel comfortable with, if they feel that they're being asked to disclose more than they feel comfortable with disclosing, if they are repeatedly invited to give talks about the lived experience of mental illness, no matter how well-meaning this is, this can be quite emotionally taxing, and it's often unrecognized how much more labor goes into giving this kind of information to people. And this can be a continuum of demands from completely well-meaning people wanting to genuinely find out more and learn more, to convince me confrontational, where people question our lived experience and demand that we convince them when it may not even be possible to do so. And this can also be a result of internalized expectations. So we can be our own worst epistemic exploiters because we might feel a duty to tell people and educate people around us, even when it makes us uncomfortable or even when it carries significant emotional costs for us. So all of this results in significant ongoing emotional labor for scholars with a lived experience of the issues that they're studying. Both giving and resisting, giving in to demands and resisting demands is exhausting because in both cases, you have to do something which your colleagues do not have to do and which your colleagues may not even recognize as a kind of exhausting labor. I really like this quote by Himani Banerjee, cited by Surma Birch. Banerjee talks about what she calls cannibalizing pedagogy, teaching about race at a Canadian university. I dissociate from my own presence in the room, but I signify, symbolize, embody a construct and teach on it. This body, along with centuries of knowing of existential and historical racism, is my teaching presence and tool. I am offering up piece by piece my experience, body, intellect, so others can learn. Unless I am to die from this violence of the daily social relations of being a non-white South Asian woman in a white Ontario, Canada classroom, I have to dissociate. So it's very difficult for those of us who do this kind of work to live in these kinds of work relationships with ourselves and with our colleagues and with our students. And to see, how to satisfy the expectations that are laid on us and how to, at the same time, retain our mental health as much as possible. And sometimes we have to do this even in the face of quite aggressive opposition. There are very existence or our very ability to know and understand is questioned by those of us who are meant to be our closest colleagues. So I will now very briefly consider what I think the role of minoritized scholars might be, which is really speculative and in many ways something that would need multiple papers probably to unpack. So as I was considering the kind of role that my lived experience in doing research that is related to my lived experience might make, One contribution is my epistemic standpoint. Knowing about my own lived experience, knowing what it is like to be a white, middle-class, educated woman with a history of mental illness, serious mental illness. But then exactly this strength in standpoint epistemology is the one that opens up the door towards the various epistemic oppressions, which I have just considered, unless it is accompanied by ethical concerns of inclusion and persons and members of the research community who are important in themselves. Then sometimes there might be expectations of activism, and this might be difficult for others, given the importance of trying to preserve my mental health. I feel that activism is not necessarily something that I can participate in. And even for those scholars who do, disability theorists write about the third shift, which is sometimes expected of already exhausted bodies, apart from our work, we also are then expected to go and do yet more work, which is again usually unrecognized. There might be expectations of being a role model or a mentor. If you are the only person with a certain characteristic in your department, then students might naturally come to you. If you're the only academic expert with your experience who also has lived experience, then people might naturally be drawn to contact you, and this can then lead to increased expectations and again increased labor when it comes to mentoring others and being a good role model. So against these various possibilities, I would like to argue provisionally that one very important role that we have as minoritized scholars is that we are sensitized to the problems related to the experiences that we are researching through our own lived experience. So as a result of living with mental illness, I have greater sensitivity to certain problems that people with mental illness face, and I have more of an insight into what other people with a lived experience of mental illness might perceive as important or as problematic. So this could be either issues related to issues, which issues are particularly important to people as it comes to their day-to-day lives, or it might be related to methodology. What kind of methodology is most suitable to studying certain problems? What methodology might be problematic? And this could be simple things like access. So people with mental illness might be more likely to drop out or might want to cancel interviews at the last moment. And I understand this from my own lived experience. So I'm more sensitive to the need for flexibility in these cases. Whereas people without lived experience might not quite understand as much why people keep canceling and rearranging things at the last moment. But then I think the same is true for our lived experience as researchers. So we again are sensitized to the kind of research, kind of environment that research takes place in, and to the various strengths and weaknesses of the current academic system. I'm sure we can all think about many of these. We are very familiar with the existing body of research, so we know what the gaps in that research are, where more work is needed, what kind of problems there are, what kind of methodological possibilities there are. And we're also familiar from our own lived experience with the research environment through past grant applications, job applications, workshops and so on. So we know what kind of research is possible to do within the research environment that we live within. But what I want to focus on for the rest of this time is the relative lack of practical solutions to all of these problems, which I have spent time explaining. So until now, really, I've been focusing on the problems, but what I want to do is to think about whether there might actually be some solutions, because there are a lot of papers that outline these problems, but not very many that offer us solutions. So one basic idea is offering safe spaces, what Goffman calls backstage, where stigma doesn't matter. So I organize a workshop for philosophers with lived experience of mental illness who also are working in philosophy of psychiatry. But I've encountered other schemes from, just safe spaces to and academic safe spaces and workshops to choirs and other kind of social spaces where academics can come together and kind of share their experiences and support each other and build community as well. But of course, that isn't quite enough to counter all of these various problems. And this is when I started thinking about my previous research on democratic deliberation. Not surprisingly, I guess, whatever we've been thinking about a lot in the past, will come back to haunt us eventually. Just don't seem to be able to get rid of my PhD, no matter how hard I try. So deliberative democracy is a form of democratic decision-making through open, inclusive, equal, and other regarding dialogue. This could mean small face-to-face groups that meet together to discuss a specific policy issue. These have been run successfully in Canada, Ireland, Australia, and these groups often make recommendations that are then publicized broadly to the rest of the electorate, especially ahead of referendums. Or it can be the kind of ongoing macro deliberation that goes on throughout society, kind of the ongoing dialogue between various parts of groups in society, the media, citizens, politicians, civil society bodies, and so on. So deliberative Democrats say that this is the main kind of democratic deliberation that really we think we should promote in society, trying to make democracy more dialogical and less adversarial. The point of deliberative theories in democracy is to move from procedural to substantive equality. So instead of just thinking of democracy as one person, one vote, giving everyone's voice giving people's voices greater equality, increasing inclusion, making space for people's voices to be heard. And this is something that really resonates with me when it comes to academia, because I think that's what we very often need when it comes to minoritized researchers. We want to make space for people's voices to be heard, whose voices would not normally be heard. And whether that's through the voices of our research participants, if we're doing qualitative or quantitative research, or the voices of people as scholars and academics, it includes both of these possibilities. But in democracy, we would argue that it's not possible to have greater deliberation without procedural safeguards that ensure equality and inclusion. And it's these procedural safeguards which I think could be useful for us in academia as well. Because of course, research environments are not democratic in the sense that politics is democratic. I mean, it would be nonsensical to expect that in many cases, in order for projects to be run and so on, you need various hierarchies, you need people to lead projects and so on. Work environments cannot be democratic in exactly the same way that politics is, and they need not be either. But I think that deliberative democracy offers us tools for the ethical inclusion of people in a dialogical research process. Of course, the problem with any kind of proposal is that it can once again result in more box ticking exercises and more admin, you know, having another I don't know, 10-page document that you have to hand in about how you're including minoritized people, instead of actually tackling structural injustice and structures of exclusion. So what I'm going to talk about now are more procedural ideals rather than trying to develop exact rules, which we can then write yet another long document about and send off somewhere into the void. And I want to focus on 3 ideas: boundary setting, agenda setting, and veto power. So the role of boundary setting would be to counter the problems of some of the problems of epistemic oppression, and epistemic exploitation, problems of disclosure, by being open about our boundaries as to what we feel comfortable to disclose, what we feel comfortable with doing as part of our work and research, given that we also have lived experience. So we should not be called on to do things which our colleagues without lived experience are not called on to do unwillingly and to the detriment of our emotional health. And this is something that should really be respected, and often already is. But I think it would be beneficial if this was something which was openly recognized and encouraged, rather than just something that happened if we are lucky enough to have a good work environment. This is also a way of formally responding to power imbalance, so saying that we need to have boundary setting rules, and having clear reasons for why we need boundary setting rules gives us a good way of responding to power imbalances, responding to requests which we sometimes are unable to comply with because of their cost for us. What this could look like in practice is obviously a question, and this is more about developing some principles rather than about developing actual practical rules, as I said. But just having a concept to refer to as we're responding to power structures may actually already be useful. The danger, of course, is that this might generate more epistemic and emotional labor for us. Once again, we need to explain about our boundaries. We need to explain why our boundaries need to be respected, and that in itself can be exhausting. The second idea I have taken from democratic deliberation is that of agenda setting. And the role of agenda setting is to capture the strengths of minoritized scholars, capture our strength as having lived experience, both as scholars and academics and researchers, and as members of a minority group. So we may have a better idea about what is important to those with lived experience. We have a better idea of how these questions can be best asked. And when it comes to small group deliberation in various experiments with deliberative democracy, this kind of deliberative process is what tends to be most successful. Coming together to discuss what's important for people actually in their day-to-day life. A very good example is participatory budgeting from Brazil, where citizens from various areas of cities are asked to set their own priorities for what they would like to spend part of the municipal budget on. And actually, it can be surprising for city administrators to find that local residents would rather spend money on transport rather than improving something else in their area. So sometimes people's priorities are different from the ones that were expected by administrators. Of course, these things only work if the agenda setting is then taken into account, if it actually counts for something. Just asking people what research agenda would be useful, what they think would be particularly beneficial from their own experience is not enough if we then don't listen to those recommendations. And co-production and the involvement of experts by experience in mental health research already does this to some extent. And the further advantage of also asking minoritized scholars is that we also have good familiarity with the academic context and recognize the limitations of what kind of research is and is not possible. But there's all kinds of co-creation and all kinds of involvement of people. It is vulnerable to co-optation. People's voices will not necessarily be listened to. It could just once again be an exercise for enforcing compliance. Finally, and most controversially, I think there might be a role for people with lived experience, scholars with lived experience, to have some kind of veto power, because we might know best when some terms are problematic. We might recognize significant problems or potentially damaging or insulting terminology. So as an example, when it comes to the use of slurs in classrooms, the voice of the people whom the slur is used against should ideally count for more than the voice of others, because they are the ones who really feel and understand just how bad these slurs could be. And similarly, Regina Rini, on her work on microaggression, argues that when it comes to deciding what is and is not an instance of microaggression, the people in the best position to know are the people who are actually experiencing that microaggression. So if most people with mental illness say that a certain practice is a form of microaggression, then it is worth listening to those people, because they are the ones who are experiencing it as detrimental and damaging. But this requires respectful listening from all parties, so both minoritized people and from majority people. And in practice, it might mean circulating ideas widely before publication or before they're further developed, asking for feedback from other scholars with lived experience, as our experiences tend to differ widely. And just from our own experience, we might not realize if something is problematic. So we need to be able to learn from each other. Of course, the problem here is that this is the usual problem of mistaking offense for harm. when do we know that something is annoying or a form of microaggression? When do we know if something is offensive or a harmful slur? How can we tell the differences? What do we do with people who supposedly take offense too easily? This is a problem which we face in many areas. But what we would not want is for a small group to veto everything based on their own narrow experiences. But at the same time, we also need to be able to listen to their experience, and we need to be able to reach some kind of compromise solution. Jane Mansbridge, one of the most important contemporary philosophers of democracy, says deliberation, in contrast to slogans, shouting, and Twitter outbursts, requires questioning others, listening hard to them, and then either finding some common ground or clarifying conflict. I think this comes back nicely to my point about veto power. Often what we can do through deliberation is to clarify conflict, learn to understand why someone finds something offensive or problematic or harmful, or learn to, or find out why what we see as problematic might actually be more a form of offense to us rather than more broadly harmful to society. As I said, formal constraints can become box-ticking exercises, so it's not my intention to introduce more of these. But I think that political decision-making has hard-fought for structures that aim to counteract some of the problems which we also found in academia when it comes to equality, inclusion, and diversity. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Zsuzsanna. That was fantastic, and so many questions and things to think about that I've been scribbling down. We're going to make it possible so that everybody is able to unmute and I think show their cameras. So where people have questions or comments, please just do pop your hand up, and then Ginny and I will have a look and just call on people to unmute and offer your comments and questions to Zsuzsanna.
Hello, thank you for a really, really interesting talk. I have a question about stigma and deliberation. So I was an observer at a deliberative process here at King's, and mental health came up as a topic on occasion, but it was something that people never seemed to feel comfortable in the room expanding on. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on how we can, when we're kind of convening these deliberative spaces, counteract that stigma that can almost be omnipresent. I mean, perhaps less so among scholars than among the public, but it's always there, really, isn't it?
Yes, I think that's definitely a problem, but I think it's difficult to know how to change that, without changing culture and society. I mean, if the deliberative meeting is particularly about mental health and people have agreed to talk about mental health, then that's something we can work with. But I think in general, respecting people's boundaries is important. It's as I said, as researchers as well, it's important to have our boundaries respected. But I think the same goes for participants of any study. We need to recognize that we have boundaries that need to be respected, because the emotional costs can be quite high otherwise.
Thank you.
Hang on, I've not used this in ages, so I may fail to be live. I wonder if I might just ask a really sort of practical question, just based on an experience I had last year, which I was involved at the last minute. I was called in to help with a book on co-production in mental health care. And I took it that my role was basically to look scholarly and I don't know, to get some academics to help buy the book. That was sort of the thing. At the same time, the co-productive process of writing this book was well established, and it seemed to me to be grossly problematic for me to come in at the last minute, as it were, and get involved. But it struck me that there was a real tension, which was that the agenda of many of the people involved in this book, as I say, ironically in a sense, on co-production, that the agendas were quite different. I mean, amongst the people who were there already, even before I arrived, and then my agenda would have been different again, because I had certain sorts of thoughts about what scholarship might look like and what might sell as a book, and so on and so forth. What should we have done, do you think, to kind of run a practical, democratic, deliberative process to bring together this book? As I say, the stakes being all the higher because the subject, in fact, the title of the book was co-production. And I'm not sure that we really got it right.
I think co-production has a lot of problems. It seems that to me that people are often, even people who are running these co-productive projects, are completely unclear on what they mean by co-production. And because of intersectionality, people will just have different backgrounds, different lived experiences, different issues. And that may actually be one of the strengths of it, to have this diversity of what people want from the book. So that might actually, for me, be a strength to say, well, we all have this commonality of lived experience, but then we have all of these differences as well. And through co-production, we're able to communicate our differences as maybe even more than our similarities. Because often we are all put into this one box of person with X, like person with schizophrenia, as if then all people with schizophrenia are the same, but there's huge variety between people's experiences. And I think calling you in at the last moment is probably an example of credibility excess as a scholar. So, because you're Professor Tim Thornton, you can be called in to give the stamp of, scholarly whatever, which is, something that people have experienced. And that's how Olufemi Stiver's project started as well. Being asked by a journalist friend, oh, can you tell me about the experience of, young Black men in inner city suburbs? And he says, well, I don't know. I'm a middle class guy. I'd have no idea what their experiences are just because I'm Black. And I think, having this kind of credibility access, knowing the idea that, you know better what it's like, because you just happen to be also known as someone with lived experience and the right credentials, it is a genuine danger in academia.
Could I just sort of make one follow-up, just really quick thing? So the last 15 years of my academic life, I've been a philosopher in a school of nursing. And one of the things that strikes me as interesting about nursing as an academic discipline, well, actually, there's something else which is really interesting, which is nursing is the only other discipline that does conceptual analysis. It's nurses and philosophers, and that's a crazy thing. There's a really interesting story to be told about that. Forget that. What's interesting about nursing, it seems to me, is that as an academic discipline doing research, they love to have named methods. So if you're doing a PhD in nursing, you have to say, I'm following Smithers's approach to grounded theory, say, or Carruthers's approach to hermeneutics. And when one of the safety elements of that is that you at least all know what you're doing. So if you get involved in, say, a Delphi project, you know what it looks like, and there is safety in that. I suppose what I wonder is, assuming that the choice of the method is not arbitrary, but people make different choices for different research projects, could there be a meta-level set of criteria which say, any well-founded, democratic, deliberative process of research that respects experts by experience, that respects minoritized scholars, and so on and so forth, anyone should have this umbrella structure? Do you think there might be something like that? Or are we always going to be, as it were, making it up reasonably enough as we go along, which will have the danger of eccentricities and blindnesses? I mean, you've given 3 things at the end of your talk to say, look at this, this, and this, and that seems. I mean, could there be a kind of global democratic structure for all such research projects?
Well, I would probably say deliberative structure rather than democratic structure. But yes, I mean, it would be great. And in that case, I hope it would be called the Chappell structure. But yes, I mean, I think it is worth looking for these kinds of principles of inclusion in philosophy of science, of social science, and philosophy of human sciences as well. So I think the philosophy of social science, is something that is a vastly promising area of research, and trying to kind of make practical, because it's so practical, trying to make practically translatable conclusions or recommendations. It's not it's very much something that is applied.
Hi, thank you. Sorry, my computer cut out at a critical moment there. Sorry. Did you get to finish your comments, Zsuzsanna?
Yes, I did.
So thank you very much, everyone. We're just about on time. Thanks for the questions and for really interesting replies as well. I'm just posting into the chat, which I think is what knocked me offline for a second. People who are not already connected with the centre, there are various ways that you can keep up with what we're doing on Twitter, on the mailing list, and on the events page. But thank you so much again, Zsuzsanna, for a really interesting talk. There wasn't time for the many questions and reflections that I had, but you've set me thinking about boundaries and the different spaces we create to hold different identities in research, and what scholarship means and what makes you a scholar, what constitutes lived experience. And I think intersectionality is at the heart of all of this. So thank you ever so much for joining us, everybody. And yeah, thanks once again to Zsuzsanna.
Great. Thank you very much again for having me. It's been a great pleasure.
Very welcome.
Thanks. Bye.